This is where the hospital stood in which Vincent van Gogh was treated for the clap in the summer of 1882. For some reason, there's no plaque. He'd caught gonorrhea, and he's left us a detailed description of the treatment he received. A catheter would be inserted into his bladder through you-know-where and gradually enlarged. Because that's what happens to men who consort with prostitutes in The Hague.
With your long blonde hair and your eyes of blue, the only thing I ever got from you was sorrow. Sorrow.
When we left you in programme 1, Vincent had set up house here with a prostitute called Psyche.
Out there playing your high-class games of sorrow.
Psyche had 2 children, and the gossips of The Hague were suggesting that the youngest was Vincent's.
Never do what you know you ought to.
This is the beach at Scheveningen. It's on the seaside outskirts of The Hague. And in Vincent's time, Hague artists used to troop out here for the day to draw the wild seas and the undulating dunes. Vincent would stay the night here with Psyche. So bohemian, he bragged. They'd sleep together on the dunes, and in the morning they'd drink hot coffee together and watch the sun going up, and then Vincent would get down to work. Vincent sent his brother Theo a drawing of himself using a contraption called a perspective frame here on the beach at Scheveningen. He'd had it built for him by the carpenter whose workshop was round the back of Vincent's studio. You can see this carpenter's workshop quite clearly in the most luminous of the Hague watercolours. So it was all going so well. He had a woman, the studio, the pictures were pouring out of him when suddenly bad luck sniffed him out again. Someone discovered he was living with a prostitute. This someone was almost certainly his old boss from Goghs in The Hague, Mr. Terstig. Terstig wrote to Vincent's father, who responded by trying to have his son committed in a lunatic asylum. It was nearby, a place called Hague. I've been there, and it's not somewhere a father should seek to lock up a son. In any case, it proved unnecessary. Vincent had pledged to marry Psyche and never ever to desert her. But after a year of getting to know her, he changed his mind. It's impossible to know exactly what went wrong between them. Psyche's mother certainly played a part. She was now living in the house with them, and since she was the one who originally sent Psyche out onto the streets, she can't have been a good influence or a welcome presence. I found Vincent's changing attitudes to Psyche hugely disappointing. I didn't expect this fickleness from him. One moment, she's his saviour, his soulmate, the only one. Then suddenly, she's become that woman. Lazy, bad-tempered, stupid. Theo did his part. He was now sending Vincent 150 francs a month, and not unnaturally resented his brother keeping a prostitute and her family on his money. Theo wanted Vincent to leave the woman, leave The Hague, smarten up and concentrate on his art. And the usually headstrong Vincent found some unexpected meekness within him and came round to the idea. But before we too flee The Hague and head back into the Dutch countryside, as Vincent did, I want to pay tribute to Christine Klasina Maria Hornig, whom everyone called Scene.
With your long blonde hair and your eyes of blue, the only thing I ever got from you was sorrow.
Maybe she drank, maybe she was a prostitute, maybe she was lazy. But she stuck with Vincent for a year, inspired his best art so far, and deserved better from him than she got.
Chains of sorrow. Sorrow.
We're northeast of Amsterdam, just about as far as you can go in Holland before you drop into the North Sea. This is Drenta. With its sodden bogs and sunken fens, this is and was one of the poorest bits of the Netherlands. People scratched a living here digging peat and picking potatoes, and because it was so grim and damp and melancholy, Drenta was cheap to live in. So this is where Vincent fled from the Hague, and how well this melancholy landscape suited his mood. The people lived like troglodytes, half above ground, half below, in lumpy, humpy cottages with moss roofs. Ghostly barges, loaded with shadowy black baggage, floated gloomily across the vistas. Vincent was here for about 3 months. He was in an awful state when he got here, having decided to desert Scene and the children. He tormented himself with it daily. When he encountered a stooped mother working in the fields or a bundled-up wife trudging along the paths, she reminded him invariably of Scene and made him feel tearful. Well, maybe, but he abandoned her nevertheless. Van Gogh wrote some of his longest and most philosophical letters from Drenta. He obviously had a lot of time on his hands in the evenings, and I guess, looking around at all this, there wasn't much else to do. Vincent wrote to his parents as well about how the sunny autumn days in Drenta alternated with stormy, wet ones. He preferred the storms, he said. He liked rain, and I don't think anyone's ever painted it as fondly or as often as he did. All Vincent's early work is glum. Working people, digging, bending, ploughing again and again in their endless toil. None of it's cheerful. But, by general repute, the grimmest work he ever produced was here in Drenta. But you know what? He never complained about the landscape or demeaned it. He always found it inspirational. To you and me, we get in a place like this and all we see are melancholy browns. But when you look at Vincent's pictures from Drenta, there's so much radiance in them, so much colour. I think it's one of his greatest talents. Where everyone else saw heartbreak and bleakness, Vincent van Gogh found beauty. In the end, it wasn't the bleakness of Drenta that drove him out of here, but the lack of money. Theo was having problems at work. With the risk of Theo losing his job, the only place left for Vincent to go was back into the arms of his family.
Wanneer je de wereld eens goed hebt bekeken, je hebt al wat moois gezien. Dan weet je meteen dat hier in Nederland verweg het best is en schoon bovendien.
Newnan, what a ghastly place. So neat, so pretty. But when Vincent turned up here, a few weeks before Christmas, 1883, this was somewhere notoriously bleak, right in the middle of the Dutch poverty belt. It's difficult these days to think of the Dutch as impoverished peasants, toiling in the fields from morning till night, digging potatoes, dying young. What a makeover they've had. But Vincent's art from Newnan is compelling evidence of just how dark and tragic and miserable and exhausting life was right here. His parents weren't pleased to see him. The affair with the whore in the Hague had upset them mightily. He told Theo that they shrank from letting him in, as if he were a big shaggy dog who'd leave muddy footprints in the living room. This is the house they lived in. Look at it, it's splendid. Vincent's behaviour was at its uncompromising worst. At dinner, he'd refused to join the rest of the family and sat apart on his own chair with his food in his lap, eating old bread crusts and cheese, which he'd have trouble chewing because his teeth were going. When they'd got over the shock of him turning up, they allowed him to clean out the mangle room at the back of the house, where the washing was done. Vincent put in a stove, he bought a few bits of modest furniture, and was soon working furiously in his first ever studio. Noonan specialised in two types of rural poverty, farming and weaving. Vincent's pictures of weavers are perhaps his most original early works. They're such strange and awkward machines, these black monsters of grimy wood, as he called them, in the middle of which sit, and I'm quoting him again, dark monkeys or gnomes or ghosts, clattering away with the sticks from morning until night. A quarter of Noonan's battered working population used to be linen weavers, and now there's just one weaver's house left in the entire town. It's become a new age shop selling occult and religious knickknacks, but when you walk in, it's still eloquently tiny and easy to imagine how little room there would have been in here for the people once the black mechanical monster was installed and chattering. He'd begun collecting people as well, with this same pictorial greed, painting peasant heads time and time again. At least 50 of these face paintings still exist, and who knows how many more have been lost. It was almost like a scientific collection of peasant specimens. He'd got interested in phrenology, that disquieting pseudoscience that was terribly fashionable in the middle of the 19th century, and whose followers believed that you could tell a person's character from the shape of their head. Phrenology was the dodgy precursor of some truly terrible ideas. The racial stereotyping of the Nazis, for one, had phrenology as its original inspiration. It's utterly discredited now, but not then, and Vincent was interested in it. In his paintings of the peasants, he often distorts the physiognomies of the Noonan people to give them animal characteristics, snout-like noses, sloping foreheads, not to denigrate them, I'm sure, but to categorise them, a touch spookily perhaps, into rural types. And the culmination of Vincent's manic investigation of country faces was the most ambitious painting of his Dutch years, the dark and entirely melancholy Potato Eaters. Vincent's father, Pastor Theodorus, died in March 1885, and he's buried here, on the spot where that tower used to stand that you see in the background of so many of Vincent's Noonan pictures. They weren't really speaking by then, they'd fallen out. But I don't think there's any doubt that the darkness of this event infected the picture that Vincent began a few days later. The Potato Eaters shows a family of nobly Noonan peasants sharing their evening meal. Potatoes with coffee. Tomorrow, for a change, they might have coffee with potatoes. Vincent was inordinately proud of this painting. He considered it his masterpiece so far. It's endearingly clumsy and very him. It's potato heaven around here. They're everywhere. Potatoes, 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 potatoes. But they're not just the staple food of the peasants. There's more to it than that. Vincent said when he was painting the potato eaters that he wanted them to feel like potatoes. The people themselves, they had hands like potatoes. They had faces like potatoes. To be honest, I never quite knew what he meant by any of that till I got here and felt these things. The people are indeed like that. They're of the earth. They're gnarled. They're brown. They're like potatoes. Once you get out of Newnan, the landscape hasn't changed that much with these plunging avenues of poplars that he so loved to paint. And Vincent had a peculiar outdoor hobby. He used to collect birds' nests and apparently had about 30 of them, all different, while he was actually here. And he used to display them in a line arranged on a decorative branch. Some of the nests came from rare birds, including, I was sad to see, the nest of a golden oriole. Why paint birds' nests? They're so difficult. I rather disapprove of Vincent collecting birds' nests. He took the eggs as well. There is this ruthlessness to him that we tend to overlook. We've become so mushy on the subject of Vincent van Gogh. Later on, when he was already at the insane asylum in Saint-Remy, he painted this beautiful study of an emperor moth. He said it had turned up in the asylum gardens at night and that he'd had to kill it to see it properly. That's meant to be Vincent going to work in the fields. He would have hated it. It's so twee. These days, Newnan is ever so proud of the fact that Van Gogh lived here for 2 years, produced some of his most powerful early works here. They love Vincent all right now, but they didn't when he was here. One of the girls from the potato eaters got pregnant. They said Vincent was responsible. And a Catholic priest from that church over there forbade his parishioners from posing for him. The town campaigned against him. Kids began throwing stones at him. They ran him out of town, so now they're milking him for all he's worth. That's not true of his next location, one of the world's most cosmopolitan cities. In November 1885, just in time to avoid the dreaded Christmas get-together of the Van Goghs, Vincent left for Antwerp. Antwerp's only 25 miles or so from where Vincent was born in Zundert, so although it's in Belgium, it was always geographically on Vincent's doorstep. But symbolically, this throbbing Brabantine metropolis, famous for art and beer and diamonds, was another world. In Antwerp, the priests didn't take to their pulpits whenever someone got pregnant because they would have had to stay up there all the time. The first place he explored was down here, the port. Typical Vincent. This was where Antwerp's low life was concentrated. Wandering through these streets in the rain, he saw a sailor being chased out of a brothel by a gang of angry prostitutes, which amused him. He was out of Newnan all right, after 2 years of grim country living, being treated as the village idiot. This was the urban shot, the complete change he needed. From now on, Vincent was an exile, a man on the move, and he never went back to Holland. The whores and the cafe girls were the only models he could get. He painted their portraits and paid them for it. What he really wanted was to paint them nude, but he couldn't afford it. He was living on bread and coffee from the time he moved out of his parents' house in Newnan to his first winter here, which is over half a year. He'd only eaten 6 or 7 hot meals. Vincent was literally starving. Armand Jules Cabernet. And some interesting evidence has emerged quite recently that Vincent was treated here, in this house, by a Dr. Cabernet for syphilis. Not only was syphilis fatal, it also drove you mad. The insane asylums of the 1880s were full of syphilitic lunatics. Vincent's doubts about his own sanity had good reason to increase. His teeth had gone. He went to the dentist here in Antwerp and had to have 10 teeth pulled out. If you've ever wondered why Vincent never smiles in any of his self-portraits, it isn't just that he's not the smiling kind, it's also because he doesn't want you to see his teeth. He was only 33 and already he was falling apart. He knew he was smoking too much, but he did it deliberately to subdue his hunger. And with a grim sense of humour that's untypical of Vincent, although it is admittedly rather Belgian, he painted what I think should be seen as a comic self-portrait, a skull with a fag in its mouth. Vincent, only 33, yet already facing death with a smile. Vincent joined the academy here in January 1886. He'd already been in Antwerp a couple of months and was, of course, a lifelong mistruster of academies. The trouble with academies, Vincent wrote to Theo from Newnan in the summer, is that they teach you to paint Louis XV and Arabs, but not weavers or diggers or sewers. Vincent loathed academies, and at the age of 33, he was singularly ill-suited to entering one. But the academy in Antwerp was the only place he could get free models, particularly nude ones. Another student, Vincent Hageman, has left us some delightful memories of Vincent's time here. He wore a blue smock of a kind usually favoured by Flemish livestock merchants, and his fur hat, of course. Hageman remembers a cast of the Venus de Milo being brought in, and Vincent drawing her with great big hips. The aghast professor picked up this drawing and covered it with corrections, slimming down the new childbearing hips of the Venus de Milo. Vincent exploded. "You clearly don't know what a young woman's like," he bellowed. "A woman must have hips, buttocks, a pelvis that can carry a child." And out he stormed. The Academy Board met in March 1886 and decided unanimously that Vincent should be put back to the elementary class. But they were too late. He'd already gone. On the 20th of February 1886, Theo Van Gogh was at work at Goupil, Boussod and Valadon, just here in the Boulevard Montmartre, when a porter from the Gare du Nord arrived with a note. Unfortunately, it was from Vincent. I say unfortunately because Theo had been pleading with Vincent not to give up his studies in Antwerp, not to come to Paris. Theo had troubles at work, he had troubles with his health, troubles with his mistress, and his flat was too small. But all this pleading made no difference. Vincent came anyway. Vincent's apartment was far too small for both of them, so the brothers moved here, to the Rue La Pique, a notably steep road up which you must puff to enter Montmartre. You don't need me to tell you about Montmartre in Vincent's time. You've seen the film, attempted the can-can. This was Paris's chief nocturnal pleasure ground, busy with dance halls, drinking dens and cabarets, a shameful hill of fun that marked the edges of civilized Paris. Van Gogh's stay in Paris is surprisingly mysterious. He wasn't writing to Theo, obviously, because Theo was here, so there's a huge gap in their correspondence. There are bits and pieces of testimony from other Parisian artists, but it tends to feel unreliable and boozy. Let's try and put this in context. When Vincent arrived in Paris in the winter of 1886, Impressionism had been the art fashion for a decade already, and the hunt was on for the next big thing. But Vincent had never even seen an Impressionist painting. There were no Impressionist pictures in Newnan, there were no Impressionist pictures in Antwerp, so he had an awful lot of catching up to do. A couple of Vincent's first Parisian landscapes look out towards the city that way, but most of them don't. Most look deliberately that way. Back there, on the slopes of the Butte Montmartre, you could still find a curious, half-rural scrubland of overgrown allotments and pocket-sized urban vineyards. And Vincent's first paintings of the half-rural Montmartre may be stylistically undecided and a touch hesitant, but they do give you a strong sense of the bleak character of the scrubland. Lots of people's dreams were broken here, not just Vincent's. Theo was complaining to anyone who would listen about the state of the apartment. There were wet paintings propped up in every corner, clothes everywhere, and all this stuff that Vincent had picked up on his walks around Montmartre. It was a disastrous domestic arrangement. Did Vincent ever screw the top back on the toothpaste tube? I doubt it. Worse even than Vincent's chronic untidiness was his genius for picking quarrels with anyone over everything. There are these touching letters from Theo back to the family in Holland in which he complains that no one came round to see him anymore. They were all too frightened of Vincent. The only solution was to get him out of the flat by enrolling him in some kind of art school. Thus Vincent briefly became a pupil of the fashionably grotesque Parisian painter Fernand Cormon. Cormon specialised in Neanderthals, great hairy primitives acting out violent scenes from the Bible. This is Cain and his tribe fleeing after the murder of Abel. Horrible, isn't it? Cormon's studio was here on the Boulevard de Clichy at the bottom of the Montmartre Hill. Cormon had a particular reputation for tolerance and seems to have had a nose for picking troublemakers. The head pupil in Cormon's studio, a kind of artistic prefect who was supposed to set the best example, was Toulouse-Lautrec. What an error of judgment that was on Cormon's part. Lautrec and Vincent became close. They'd go drinking and whoring together. and Lautrec produced a memorable pastel drawing of Vincent in a cafe much like this, staring thoughtfully into the distance, either because he had lots on his mind, or, more likely, because he'd been drinking too much of that absinthe in front of him and his elastic had snapped. Absinthe was the drug of choice in Montmartre. And you know how, when you pour some water into it, it turns a yellowy green? Well, they used to call it the Green Fairy, and Vincent liked it so much that he painted a still life of a glass of absinthe that feels almost like a loving portrait of it. The chief hallucinogenic ingredient of absinthe is called wormwood, which gets its name from the biblical story of Satan disguised as a snake hiding in the tree of knowledge and tempting Eve. A sensible man steers clear of absinthe, but Toulouse-Lautrec and Vincent van Gogh didn't or couldn't.
Madame Arthur de Paul de Coq. Madame Arthur est une femme qui fit parler.
This is where a cafe called the Tambourin used to stand. It served delicious Italian food, served up by fetching wenches dressed in Italian peasant outfits. The tables were tambourine-shaped and presided over by the Tambourin's interesting owner, Agustina Segatori. She was from Naples originally, but came to Paris to be a model, and with her dark Neapolitan beauty, she made a passable Egyptian slave girl or Turkish harem wife in those absurd Orientalist fantasies that Cormon and his friends were producing. When Vincent encountered Agustina, she was in her late 40s, swarthy, a faded beauty, his kind of woman. He painted her in the corner of the Tambourin, dragging on a fag. Vincent and Agustina had some sort of affair. This is surely her, in the rather frantic and angrily sexy nudes that Vincent suddenly emerged with. It's not the Vincent we're used to. I don't know how good your geography of Paris is, but if you imagine the hill of Montmartre here with Sacré-Cœur on top, the River Seine flows along the front and then doubles back on itself in a sharp loop. So if you walk down from Montmartre Hill in this direction, you end up where I'm standing now, at Agnes, the notorious riverside pleasure ground of the Impressionists. The Monets and the Renoirs made something terribly pretty out of Agnes, but Vincent didn't. Vincent's Impressionism has a bleakness to it that no Frenchman would have sought out or admitted to. He used to walk here from Montmartre with a new pal, the painter Signac, who was a pointillist, a dot painter. They'd work around here all morning and then stop off for a late lunch on the way back. Vincent painted a couple of the restaurant interiors that he and Signac used to drop into, and they're done hilariously in the full dot manner that was all the rage that year. When you look at Van Gogh's Parisian output, it's like looking at a big box of samples. Shall I paint this way or that way? Shall I be an impressionist or will I take up the dot and pointillise? Van Gogh produced 230 paintings in his 2 years in Paris, and hardly any of them seem alike. A certain Siegfried Bing had opened up an exotic Oriental emporium in the Rue de Provence, packed with imported Japanese goodies. Vincent was soon a regular visitor, and with Theo's money, he was buying in bulk. The brothers began manically collecting Japanese prints, hundreds and hundreds of them. Geishas, actresses, musicians, courtesans. On the left is a courtesan from Vincent's collection. On the right is an exact copy of her that Vincent did. It's slyly erotic, but then so was he. Here's another of these peculiar copies. Plum Trees in Flower, originally by Hiroshige. Vincent added some extra calligraphy to it. I've had it translated. It's an advertisement for a brothel called Yoshiwara's. And you know what? The Van Gogh Museum still has the tracing paper he used. Squared up, exact. Japanese prints changed Van Gogh's art as the sun coming up in the morning turns night into day, as they say around here. The great divide in his work is between his pre-Japan pictures and the post-Japan ones. His colours become clearer, brighter, the perspectives less Western. Shadows are banished, and a striking Japanese flatness enters his work. Vincent was so excited by his own Japanese prints that he organised a Montmartre exhibition at the Café Tambourin to show them off. You can just about make them out on the wall behind Agustina Segatori. The umbrella on her stool, that's definitely Japanese. It was probably bought at Bing's. A gift from Vincent, perhaps. This is Agustina too, after extreme Japanese surgery. Vincent fell out with her. Vincent fell out with everybody. Gay Paris nearly finished Vincent off and certainly ruined his health. He later complained that he'd become an alcoholic here. His nerves were shot from the constant arguments, the late nights, the absinthe, the bitching and the backstabbing. His fellow painters, he spat, disgusted him. Now, one of Van Gogh's more reliable character traits was a tendency to rush into decisions. Once he'd made his mind up to go away from somewhere, he was on the next train out. The departure from Paris was as abrupt as the arrival had been. As the train puffed out of Paris, all Vincent could think about, he wrote to Theo, was his arrival in Japan. He meant it as a befuddled metaphor, I suppose. Where he was really going was the town of Arles in the south of France. He stepped off the train on Monday, the 20th of February, 1888, to find Arles blanketed with snow. Who would have thought it? I spoke to a chap at our hotel who's lived here all his life, and he's only seen snow once. So this was truly exceptional weather. But Vincent was far too excited to let this unlikely snow dampen his enthusiasm. Besides, these were the only possible weather conditions that could make the south of France resemble Japan. A vague resemblance, perhaps, but a resemblance nevertheless. If you've never been here and you only know Arles through Vincent's art, which is how most people in the modern world first get to know it, then it's my duty to tell you that Arles is none of the things you think it is. When I first came here, I was expecting a sleepy and cute Provençal country town, surrounded by sunflowers and lavender, populated by kindly country folk, brown as nuts, because that's the image of the place Vincent has left us. But Arles isn't like that at all, and wasn't then. Vincent complained that it was a dirty town, surprisingly industrialised, the manufacturing centre of French rolling stock, trains, carriages, they were all made here. Look carefully at the horizons of his distant views of Arles, and you'll see as many belching factory chimneys as there are church steeples. Where there are factories and the railways, there's misery, and Arles had plenty of that. A few days after he arrived, Vincent was walking through here, the red light district of Arles in those days, when a commotion broke out outside a brothel. 2 Italians had murdered a pair of local soldiers, zouaves they were called, light infantrymen stationed in the town. Vincent took advantage of this murderous commotion and popped into the brothel himself. He became a frequent user, but as a result of this sensational double murder, every Italian in town was run out of Arles. Arles was good at running people out of town, as Vincent himself would later find out. But not just yet. While the snow was still on the ground, that marvellous weather-defying nut tree, the almond, was already blossoming. Vincent picked a branch, took it to his hotel, put it in a glass, and watched it so fondly. There was snow outside, but in his little room, spring had come. And soon, everything was in bloom in the orchards, and Vincent embarked upon an orgy of blossom painting. He produced 14 pictures in a few days, pears, peaches, cherries, and he envisaged them hanging in threes to form triptychs, like religious pictures. Here at last was a religion he could give his all to once again, the religion of nature. You know, so many people come to Arles hoping to find the real Van Gogh. The trouble is, there's not much of the real Van Gogh left. What the good people of Arles didn't knock down, the Second World War bombers got rid of. However, if you really poke about and search hard, there are some places that come up as a little bit of a surprise. I mean, he did so much work when he was here, so many paintings, so many watercolours, so many drawings, that if you look around, you're bound to come across some of them again, like this beautiful little bridge here. One of the chief reasons Vincent had chosen to come to lowly Arles, out of all the places he could have gone to in the south of France, is because the town was famous for its women. Les Arlesiennes, they were called. They wore picturesque black costumes and were said to be the most beautiful women in France. Vincent was disappointed to find when he got here that the town wasn't overrun by beautiful Arlesiennes, as he'd imagined. It's one of the first things he complains about. But just as he was to edit Arles itself to fit his mental image of it, so the proprietress of the cheap bar he'd found rooms in, Madame Ginoux she was called, was turned into the enticing Arlesienne of Vincent's imagination. This was a pub landlady who ran an all-night bar. But Vincent, who'd always had this thing about women in black, makes her noble and thoughtful. And if you line up all the women he ever yearned for in his life, you'll find a powerful family resemblance. Sad, dark women with much on their mind were Vincent's preferred type. No one's ever said anything happened between Vincent and Madame Ginoux, and I don't suppose it ever did. But this was his kind of woman. But look closely at the back of this compelling billiard scene he painted of Madame Ginoux's all-night bar. Isn't that her? And couldn't that be him? In the nights, Vincent drank. In the days, he painted. This was his preferred route out of Arles, the Tarascon Road. Vincent did a painting of himself striding into these fields. Unfortunately, it was destroyed in the Second World War. Perhaps the greatest loss there's been in Van Gogh's art. It's such a poignant image of him, troping off to work like a peasant farmer. I really wish I could show you the real thing, but at least we've got this. Someone had the wit to take a photograph before it was burnt. Vincent in his splattered blue overalls and straw hat, lugging around his painting gear like a porter at Paddington Station. As he trudged along these roads in this heat, weighed down with all sorts of painters' luggage, it's not surprising that Vincent started to look for ways of losing some of that luggage. In any case, he was running out of paint and canvas because he was so alarmingly prolific. But with a typical piece of Vincent ingenuity, he soon found a new way to work outdoors. Luckily for him, the roadsides of Arles are overgrown with these things, the Camargue reed. Now, Vincent knew that Rembrandt had used reeds and made great works with them. The thing is, they're absolutely everywhere. They're free, plentiful, and they're terribly easy to turn into pens. All you need is a knife, a decent stout reed, and look at that. It sharpens up so beautifully into a lovely point. And they're surprisingly versatile. When you look at Vincent's drawings, the reed drawings he did here, all that stippling, the dots, the lines, they really do represent the hay fallen over, the harvest growing, the trees blossoming. He really was so masterful with this. And I think there's something very fitting about the fact that this stuff gathered from nature's bounty should have been responsible for so many of his most delicate Arles pictures. So light to carry around, so easy. There you go. This is Montmajour, a complex of medieval ruins on a hill from which there are splendid views to be had of Arles in the distance with the plain of La Crau in between. Vincent produced one of his finest reed pen drawings from this viewpoint. He walked here a considerable journey from Arles with his soldier friend, Second Lieutenant Millier, the Zouave, to whom Vincent was now giving drawing lessons. Reed pen is black and white, of course, but when the two of them looked down at this great vista, they must have noted how yellow it was. The harvesters, the wheat fields. And in this golden sea, some particularly vivid patches of yellow would have stood out. It's just a cheap cash crop around here, grown in bulk to make cooking oil for frying sausages. But by the time Vincent van Gogh had done with it, this cheap yellow cash crop would have been transformed into the most famous flower ever painted.